Good afternoon. I'm Brett Perlman, and welcome to this week's edition of the Center for Houston's Future Leadership Webcast Series. These webcasts are intended to inform, engage, and educate the community on a range of issues and topics affecting the Houston region. Through these conversations, we're building a framework on leadership in times of crisis, looking at how leaders respond to a complex and systemic challenge such as this pandemic. Through these conversations, we hope to consider the implications of the current situation and determine what actions we as a community must take to ensure the social, cultural, and economic well-being of the Houston region. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Russell Richard. Russell?
Thanks, Brett. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webcast. We appreciate you tuning in. For those of you who've joined us over the course of the last 10 weeks, we hope these webcasts have been informative and helpful in understanding the very complex and multifaceted COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Russell Richard, Vice President, Leadership and Engagement with Center for Houston's Future. The center was established in the year 2000. This year is our 20th anniversary. The center works to convene business, government, and community stakeholders in fact-based strategic planning and collaborations on issues of the greatest importance for the future of the Houston region. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the center's leadership alumni on the webcast today. Thank you so very much for your continued support of the center and its work. For those who'd like more information about the center and our leadership program, please contact me or visit our website, futurehouston.org. Our next leadership forum is scheduled for September 24th of this year. Classes already half full, so please contact me soon for more information about the program and registration. Today is the 10th in our webcast series. 10 weeks ago, we began looking at the timing, stages of a crisis. Then we examined the principles of adaptive leadership and how they might apply during this crisis. We had a chance to talk with a politician about the role that elected officials should play during the time of crisis. We had the great pleasure of speaking with one of Houston's leading healthcare scientists and doctors about COVID-19 pandemic and the virus itself. He helped us better understand some of the models that he and his team created to help local officials make tough decisions like shelter in place. We also looked at public policy and what needs to change moving forward to ensure a better healthcare system. We spent some time with social scientists to discuss how the state of Texas and the Houston region should reopen safely. Have the opportunity to talk with one of Houston's leading business leaders, prominent business leaders, on how COVID-19 has impacted the business community. Here just last week, I had the opportunity to talk with the city of Houston's COVID-19 relief and recovery czar about some of the measures the city of Houston is currently taking to continue reopening the city safely. I want to build on that conversation today and talk about how do we return to work safely? What does that look like? What can we expect in the short, the midterm, and long term? We will have a full Q&A at the end of the conversation, so please use your Q&A feature to submit your questions during the conversation. Also, please feel free to chat with others on the webcast. My guest today is Rives Taylor with Gensler architecture firm. Rives has over 30 years experience in institutional and commercial architecture. He spent the last 25 years focused on strategic planning, programming, and sustainable designs for facility operations, to campus, to city planning. Rives is an educator and a practicing architect. He directs Gensler's Firmwide Design Resilience Task Force, and he's part of the leadership team that's rolling out Gensler Cities Climate Challenge Initiative. Also, he's a proud member of the Center for Houston's Future Business Civic Leadership Forum, spring of 2012. Rives, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to have you on the webcast.
Thank you, Russell. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with our colleagues and our city leaders. And again, an amazing organization that the center is, and what a great group to really think about what our city's next steps are for a successful and vibrant recovery, if not, launch into the 21st century.
Well, thank you so much. It's good to see you again. And I'm hoping that you and your family and loved ones, those close to you, and also the Gensler team are all doing well.
We're doing very well, thank you. And a lot of what we'll talk about today, the Gensler team globally, 50 offices, have really followed. So, back to the old notion of the guinea pig, what we'll talk about is we believe strongly to walk the walk, which again is the principles of the Center for Houston's Future. So we're doing well, thank you. I hope everybody's doing well on the call today too.
Wonderful. Rives, in previous conversations we've discussed with other guests that we can't go back to the way things were before the crisis. We must move forward, we must change, and we have to get better moving forward. And as we continue to reopen the city, there's a discussion about how we return to work safely. And there are a lot of questions about how we do that. How do we return to work safely? What does the work environment look like? How do we continue to access some of the amenities and services that we were so used to before this crisis? You and your team have been thinking about and studying some of these questions, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to kind of comment on some of your findings.
Well, again, how big and how broad is that question? Every city, every almost neighborhood has a different answer, a different conversation. But let's be clear, we've all been working. It's returned to working as a collaborative family face-to-face. That's kind of the big deal. We as human species, we as social creatures do better by being together, whether it's at a sporting event or working hard on a deadline for your clients. So we've been working over the last 10, 11 weeks. We've, as a firm, have been, basically virtual since roughly Friday the 13th of March, and we've learned a lot. And we've learned a lot in doing some recent surveys that we'll be sharing with the collective folks on this call at the end that we're sharing publicly about, what are people thinking about working at home, working virtually? But the move to bring people back is going to be in stages. I think, very much, Russell, you earlier said now, soon, and later. And each of those approaches have some implications across our city, both, doing the work, and work is at places as diverse as a hotel, a hospital, a manufacturing plant, our wonderful folks, not only in hospitals, but in mass transit, as well as in an office. But it's also, as we've experienced in our teams who are returning to a work environment outside of their homes in places like Europe and China, where they're a little bit farther ahead, it means, how do I leave my house at the beginning of the day? When do I leave my house? When do I arrive at work? Or how do I get to work, including mobility? Getting to work, let's say I work in a downtown office building. Am I driving? How is that now going to be accommodated with more people driving, perhaps? The parking, going from the parking to the building, going in the building that is a landlord's building, perhaps, and then literally getting to where you'll sit to collaborate and work together. It's all going to be very different. It's going to ask us to ask, or it's going to give us the opportunity to ask some very good questions about why do we want to come back to a centralized work environment, since our focus is work in, say, an office building. What do I need to feel comfortable coming back? And what's my expectation? Not just what do I need, but what am I expecting that environment to accommodate, to allow, and to support me? And that's going to be something we've not asked ourselves all that often. We've taken many things for granted. And in this era of uncertainty, we're going to have a lot more clarity and a lot more trust that things are being done to support a healthful environment with or without a vaccine, because we're now recognizing how important well-being is across all of those, if you will, focuses of our daily life.
Well, you mentioned something, Rives, that kind of stood out to me. You said, expectation. What are people expecting? And interestingly, you and your Gensler team recently did a survey, and I'm not sure if that survey was just for Gensler employees or if it went outside of, into the general public. But you heard back from a lot of people that told you they are ready to return to work, and there are certain things that they miss. They miss things like the camaraderie, they miss the connection, they miss the team atmosphere. Can you talk a little bit more about what are some of the things that you guys are doing to kind of help meet some of those expectations, because things are going to look a little different when we get back to the office?
So the there's a couple of things that have been generated by our industry, and particularly by Gensler, with this sort of laser focus on the reality of the collaborative work environment and, frankly, the vibrant city. You know, all of these things add up to the vibrant city. So back to Houston's future. The recent document research is under our what we call our workplace index. We have, over the last plus or minus 14 years, really focused on what makes a workplace, whether it be an energy company, a law firm, a hotel, headquarters, you know, what makes those workplaces sing? And we focused not only on the collaboration and the learning and the socializing, as well as the focused work, to really understand, you know, what makes a work environment of various natures attractive, what recruits and retains the best and the brightest, whether it be a young talent or an old guy like me. What we have found in a recent set of surveys, and these surveys did include Gensler members, but it's really plus or minus 2,300 global office workers through a pretty rigorous research component based on the Gensler Research Institute, an organization that is driven by our research focus within our firm. And of these samples, this 2,300 group of people, over 85% want to get back to a collaborative work environment now. Now, they recognize it's going to be staged and phased, and likely, you know, we'll be looking at certain, you know, population groups in certain cities, and I'll come back to that in a minute, coming in at different times. But it's clear whether you're a young professional or, you know, if you will, a baby boomer, there's very different appreciations of what you're looking for to return. It's interesting, but in the surveys that we're releasing in stages, in the first one, we're going to be giving you the links at the end of this conversation, the young professional is the one that misses the collaborative environment the most. They're missing the mentorship. They're missing the peer partnership. They're missing the opportunity to say, this is work, and I'm going to focus, and I'm going to collaborate, and I can step away, because the blurring in this virtual world is really causing a lot of uncertainty. Sure. Did I accomplish what I need to? Did I get the feedback to say, you know, you've got it right, or here's how we can improve? I will come back to say, you know, the idea too of, you know, when people go back and how people go back, as witnessed by our own protocols for Gensler returning to global offices from London to Singapore and Shanghai, Beijing, San Jose, Costa Rica, it really depends on, you know, how is the community doing with its caseload, with the increase or leveling off of COVID discovery and or treatments. How, part two, is the landlord, the downtown Houston district, if you will, as well as the landlord, how are we doing with everything from the cleanliness of the building, how you check in, how folks who are perhaps not as well as they should be caught, treated, encouraged through respectful approaches to maybe not come to work, how to approach the elevator, how to get to the office. And then third step is, so what is the office protocol? Back to that expectation. You know, the fact that we need to be X feet away is an evolving science. And that's kind of, I think, one of the big ahas we'll talk, I think, a bit about here in a minute or two, is there's not a definitive, this is right. And in fact, this is right will vary from one part of the city to the next, and perhaps from one city to the next. So it's very localized, and that is something we're not, back to, that's not something we're used to. We think a one size fits all, I can go from office to restaurant to store, back again, across the street, around, all of that's, we're going to rethink. And in the long term, we're going to get back to that freedom, but we're going to have probably a heightened awareness of certain components around wellness.
Rives, thank you very much. I want to pause just for a moment and remind our viewers to please submit your questions now using the Q&A feature in your Zoom app, and we'll get to as many of those questions after our conversation. Also, if you take a look at your chat box, we have provided the link to the Gensler survey and some of the other information that Gensler has been working on here over the last few months. Rives, we were in your office maybe earlier this year, maybe 2 or 3 months ago, maybe a little longer than that. And your building, your office building, was undergoing construction or renovation, massive renovation. And I'm curious to know that, given everything that has happened here in the last few months, is that renovation plan still a good one for you guys? Or are you going to have to go back to the proverbial architect drawing board and redo and rethink some of the things that you were constructing when we were there.
Well, that's interesting. We moved from a location we'd been in for many, many years, multiple decades over at Pennzoil, wonderful building, historic and really iconic, over to 2 Houston Center for a number of reasons, which included perhaps most importantly, creating a very collaborative space on a single or a pair of floors versus where we were before. We were on multiple floors, which were great, but it didn't let people see each other. There's 2 responses, Russell, that I think is really important here. We believe on many fronts that we continue to focus on the long-term life cycle trend of how people work in a safe, productive way. How the office environment or any work environment is very much about creating a quality, productive environment that allows for servicing your customers. There's a lot of things in that, but we also believe, I think, in the long term that resource use, whether it's the scale of the space you're in, the electricity, the water, et cetera, all of that is part of the bigger picture we continue to focus on in terms of both the resilience, the climate focus that as the city of Houston is addressing, how do we make it a better city with each and every one of our projects, each and every one of our spaces. So when we made the move, it was all about collaboration, and we provided enough space for that to occur. The evolution of open office, what are called hoteling spaces or part-time spaces, probably in the short term we're going to have to look at and very quickly understand both in terms of population scale. Is it 100% people coming back? Is there a target of 25 to 50%? All driven, by the way, very localized. It's not a one-size-fits-all, meaning how do you get into the building? What are the pinch points like the elevators? Can you walk stairs instead of being in elevators? And so numbers of people coming back when are all very localized to the city, to the building, to the nature of the office space. We've been reading a lot about, maybe temporary retrofits of plexiglass or other dividers so that if somebody sneezes, an issue, that it's not infecting or creating problems across an entire office.
Sure.
But what's key is we do not have definitive answers. We're still in a mode where there are not science to say this will work definitively. And for any of us creating a built environment to say, use Ajax, use product ABCD, and you'll be guaranteed to be well, we've never had that capability. Wellness is a very complex element from your own DNA and frankly behaviors to, yes, the built environment, which we've all come to recognize through its design, through its operations, had real impact on your well-being. Therefore, our own office, we elevated everything from daylight and views, fresh air, or better air exchange, wellness focuses that are historically and continue to be very important for the life cycle value of human well-being and productivity. There's a lot of data that's showing that perhaps being outside and collaborating may reduce some of the COVID challenges. We also are seeing that immune systems are very much energized by connectivity to outside, to natural views, to fresher air, to daylight being your light rather than the flickering fluorescent. Sure. Immune system advantages, we believe, we're seeing the science, is an important facet both now but in the long term, and our office was very much about that. Spacing, proximity, conference rooms full of people. In the short term, that's probably something we'll have to either underutilize, not use, or rethink. But in the long term, it doesn't behoove or it doesn't make sense, whether you own the building or have a lease space, an office space, to rearrange dramatically until we understand the science and some of the implications of even building systems better than we do now.
Rives, you mentioned a couple of things that I want to come back to. You mentioned climate. You also mentioned wellness and public health. As companies come back to work, downtown in particular, I think we'll see people coming back in phases. What does that mean for the downtown area and some of the other work centers around town?
Well, there's a good bit of debate in the various circles of both public health leaders, but also urban planners and leaders, Central Houston Inc., Downtown Houston Management Company, that are trying to understand, the nature of people being attracted to being downtown or any workplace. There's some debate about whether there's going to be a resurgence of suburban office or workspace environments where, people basically get up, get in the car, drive, work, go home, and minimize contact with other people, that may work for a while, but that's not what draws people to live in cities. We are seeing in some parts of the country where people, do want to move to a suburban mindset, but it is a fraction of the entirety of the workforce. We believe the future of the city is only going to be exponentially more important. It's not only where there is the healthcare provision and, frankly, the activity for supporting the gross domestic product, but the downtown is where that innovation, where the ideas, where the collaboration occurs. We've been doing at home. Why do we need to leave home if we're going to a dispersed office environment versus being in the center of things? We have to keep coming back to why would people come back to work in an office? And that includes not just the space, but where it is, the connectivity to, we hope in a short period of time, not decades away, but maybe months away, that, we can start to be more carefully collaborative, more carefully social. And the investments in the downtown world, that's there. We just need to be patient to find, the opportunity to see a baseball game, maybe spaced out differently, or restaurants, all of which have to be viable and all of which are designed to meet, what were health codes that may be updated and tweaked. But fundamentally, how we've designed our built environment has, up until 2 or 3 months ago, been very viable. And, we now build into a very important factor, which is we're now learning new behaviors. Downtown can be very viable with, just a better behavior of washing hands, covering the face. Perhaps if you're not feeling well, that's the day to stay home. Whereas that built environment is there to support an amazingly diverse urban life, which is why we're living where we are.
I must say, Gensler is quite aggressive company, and you've given me quite the education here recently about Gensler and some of your work. I think the layperson may assume that architect firms like yours are only focused on designing and constructing buildings. But at Gensler, your work is much broader than that. You're thinking about things like safety and security, the environment, climate change, and low carbon, and a host of other things. How do you think we address climate change and resilience now, given all the focus on public health and this pandemic?
Well, you've actually made, Russell, an extremely important observation, which is number one, as a firm, we actually have a very broad design portfolio. We'll design the products that are in our built environment, whether it's hotel, airport, offices, the lamps, the lighting fixtures, the chairs, the carpets, all the way up to doing brand new projects, whether it be in Saudi Arabia, China, elsewhere, where we're looking at, if not entire cities, parts of cities. But the fundamental component is within that design methodology is a complex mix of community focus, client support, our own belief and passions and if you will, aspirations, as well as principles. And within those principles, wellness, or the focus on human productivity and diversity, inclusive design, broad, diverse design, respecting the diversity that are our populations in many ways. We really believe that the design of the human environment within the natural environment, there's a balance there. It's about human experience. And therefore, really in the design process, we always have believed that the center is, our clients who bring us to develop these spaces for their teams, for their own clients, et cetera. But that human component is the focus. Sure. And that's a challenge because we're not all the same, but yet there are some fundamental elements we're doing a lot of research around in terms of how we experience space and how, in partnership with the appropriate consultants, we look at health, safety, and welfare, not only code, but going beyond that. But what that brings up is what we're facing in the last few months has simply underlined what we have always been working on, whether it's life safety, ADA access, or other components connected to human experience. This is really an opportunity for the designers across the board in our city and beyond to really step up and say, here's the value to design. This is not simply just building something. We're thinking ahead, recognizing now that we need to be perhaps far more agile, far more respectful of what may be shifts. The fact that the climate is shifting, we can debate its sources or the reason, but whether we're seeing a lot more heat, a lot more rain, or other way around, not a lot less rain, a lot more cold. I mean, the weirding that's going on, we as designers are addressing because, the definition of resilience is creating a durable and agile environment that can withstand change and, if not, in fact, thrive on that change. And that's kind of, I think, the nuance of good design, is how can we create places to thrive with some uncertainty that we're facing.
Well, Rives, next week my guest is Dr. Stephen Kleinberg, who I'm sure you're very familiar with. And Steve just released a new book, and I think the timing and the title of that book couldn't be more appropriate right now. As you know, Steve has long held that the city of Houston, the Houston region, is working its way through a reality that other parts, major metropolitan areas of the country, will be working through in the years to come. One thing that I think is a little different about Houston and unique about Houston is that we are the energy capital of the world. And as we've seen over the last few months, the oil and gas industry has really taken a hit. We've seen the lowest oil prices that we've ever seen, I think. You guys are thinking about, climate change, renewables, and that sort of thing. Do you think that that discussion will accelerate or be delayed given everything else that we're dealing with right now?
Well, it's been interesting. Just before the pandemic hit earlier this year, end of last year, the Greater Houston Partnership, led by a great colleague, Bobby Tudor, with whom I went to school a while ago. The point is, Houston has always been about an innovation approach to what is basic human needs of energy. And energy in any form is something that, as a human species, that require lighting. Our buildings could be great if we didn't have to have human beings in them. We'd have to be comfortable. We have to have lighting. We have to have safety, security, the elevators. We will always need energy. And frankly, my world around the built environment is primarily electricity, a little bit of natural gas for heating and some of the food prep. And of course, addressing how we use these energy sources or electricity sources is a constant focus of the innovators of the quote unquote old oil and gas, now energy companies. The reality too is so much of our products, so much of the stuff we rely on also comes from the oil and gas industry. Years ago, in working in Saudi Arabia on a project for King Abdullah, the then king, even his focus was, let's use this resource for long-term viability rather than burning it up to create fast energy, as he called it. The idea here being is that the resources you're talking about from the quote unquote energy companies, again, broad group of moving, drilling, creating, that innovative spirit is about energy. That innovative spirit is about materiality. That innovative spirit is also very much about, if you will, storage of energy, the battery technology of the future. We need that because we'll always be in demand of energy. The oil and gas, as it relates to transportation, is outside my wheelhouse. But I believe, what's important with the capability of Houston is, fundamentally, we still have the population globally that's growing. We still have basic human needs, including housing, safety, social equity, viability of people to work, learn, be safe. That has as its fundamental some key things. Number one, resources. Resources used in an effective and stewardship mindset, meaning it can't be wasted. But more importantly, we have had over the last, number of centuries, decades, an impact on the environment that arguably, and people do, have caused some dramatic shifts of how things work. We've been used to continuity. We now may be looking at perhaps some uncertainty. Back to the inventiveness that's Houston. The idea of drilling on a platform above, miles deep water, that's really innovation. That's really looking at safety, looking at the opportunities as well as the challenges of this, if you will, unique situation. Let's bring that kind of thinking to the city, to our communities. And that's, a climate focus for us is a long-term recognition that our built environment, our human beings, our natural environment has to be kind of we have to refocus on its viability, its resilience, its longevity, with an increasing challenge situation as it relates to what we're seeing recently here in Houston, from rains and heat, and yes, economic uncertainty. And again, Professor Kleinberg, an old professor of mine who I very much value his insight, comes down to it's the people. It's supporting the people. And our design, and all designers feel this way, it's about supporting the best of the people so they can, in fact, be innovative and look for these answers in what is perhaps a challenging time.
I really do appreciate all of your insight. Again, I want to remind our viewers to please submit their questions now, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions after our conversation. I mentioned also earlier that we've provided a link to some of the information that Rives and Gensler is working on. Rives, before we go into Q&A, I want to pull up the slides that we're referring to, your back to office slide and your U.S. work from home survey. I want to pull those up and maybe have you say a little bit more about each
Sure.
of those slides
Happy
before we go into Q&A. Is that okay?
Certainly. So we, in fact, have been working across a number of program types. We call them practice areas. We do projects that range from, if you will, the spec office building downtown, for instance, just finished with Skanska, the Bank of America Tower. We worked with the Hess, Trammell Crow for the Hess Tower. So full buildings to the interiors. We do airports. We also work with mission critical computer facilities. We do hospitals to some extent, but primarily, retail, healthcare, and hospitality, hotels, resorts, restaurants. So across all of these different components, our leaders have taken a step back and say, what in both the near term, the now and soon, as well as the later long term are the best approaches and it's processes that make sense for each of our clients in very diverse cities, very diverse locales with very different health challenges, public health challenges, perhaps. How might we come back? And so this particular one, focusing on the office environment, is a toolkit that we've released publicly through our two CEOs, Diane Hoskins, Andy Cohen, producing together with our research institutes a lot of experience, having surveyed hundreds of our clients and their insight and what they're expecting and needing. So this is a very good start to understand the workplace and look at something about, if you will, the partnership, if you have the space with your landlord, with your city, looking at maybe some interim technologies without having, as I said, a definitive answer, but really more of a process to understand steps toward a collaborative work environment in one location. So this is a resource that, as I said, has a number of variations based on different kinds of workspaces, but this is the office environment. And then the next one, if you want to show, is the first of the work from home survey, the one that I referred to, the 2020 first step, looking at how many people of the different generations within our work environment really feel it's time in this staged approach, this careful approach to get back to the collaborative environment. And in this survey also is the top 10 of what we have seen in interviewing our clients, as well as this survey of 2,300 scientifically assembled survey team or survey group, what those who are returning to the office want to see. What's most important to them? Everything from understanding the cleaning protocols to having a clarity of how I get to my workspace, to expectations. The idea of what will the rest of my members coming do so I feel comfortable, from the masks to social or physical distancing, etc. And so we have a good sense of what it takes for those who are running the offices or running the office buildings or running the workspace. What are we seeing that those who are wanting to come back need to have to make them feel comfortable? And then the last slide is that larger component that you mentioned earlier. We see the climate is tied to many of these conversations: wellness, comfortability, and if you will, predictability that we can attain to make work a focused place. The Gensler Cities Climate Challenge is focusing on how we operate the buildings, both the energy that may in fact have some short-term challenges with some thinking of protocols for air exchange and perhaps use of electricity to enhance the work environment in this transitional time, how we make the buildings, the materiality, as well as looking at how we get to and from our workplaces. And so this is focusing in the next 10 plus years how we can, as designers, support our built environment and our clients in their operations of the buildings to take the steps to tackle what could be in a longer term as much of a health and economic challenge as we've seen in the last several months with the COVID challenge. Climate could be, in our mind, an upheaval that we can prepare for. We have a chance to prepare for, but could, in fact, without proper preparation and resilience thinking, provide or create some real challenges for our economic, social, and environmental viability of the city.
Rives, thank you so much for that overview. This is quite impressive work that you and the Gensler team are doing. Again, I want to remind our viewing audience that we have provided a link to that information, so please at your leisure take a closer look. Rives, I want to kind of shift gears now and get to some of the questions from our viewers. And the first question is, how does design and architecture relate to social trends and issues? And what does architecture have to do with climate change?
Well, I'll start with the last one first, and then the first one will be the tougher one. If you look at the statistics, at roughly half of whether you're looking at emissions or the creation of greenhouse gases, half of that challenge comes from our built environment. The majority in, let's say, the next 30 years are the electricity, or is the electricity to make the day in and day out environment work, turning on the lights, riding the elevator, having your computer on, being comfortable and secure. The electricity to run our built environment, plus the creation of the built environment, the new buildings and materiality, are over half the battle connected to climate. Even looking at things like the deforestation, looking at the creation of you know, the commuting in cars and trucks. So the built environment is the lion's share of the conversation around the burning of fossil fuels for electricity generation and creating the materiality. So therefore, we believe within our Gensler Cities Climate Challenge that, you know, the industry of design and building ownership really have an outsized capability to make a difference. And in fact, many of our clients, from the Bank of Americas, the Googles, the Microsoft, many have publicly come out and said, even with the challenge we're facing now, climate is still a focus, we believe, for the benefit of our communities, to be honest, our shareholders and our own members of the business community. We need to focus on that. And the design of our built environment is squarely behind that. The social side, the equity, the inclusivity are basically connected to everything from how we design our workspaces for inclusive design, those who aren't fully, if you will, capable to move, to see, to hear. Inclusive design is something that has now come into its own frontier by virtue of just rethinking everything from how we open and close doors, whether we touch them or not. In terms of the broader social component, we spend a lot of time in our firm with something called our Community Impact Studio, where we are engaged in educating where we can in K through 12 STEM classes. We very much focus as architects on the housing question in places like California, Austin, Texas, etc. And so not only in our everyday design, where we need to address the social access, the social quality, looking at underserved communities to still have quality environments to learn, to work, to get better, hospitals. We also have a very powerful outreach to our communities around impactful design, whether it's pro bono, semi bono, or outright giving to community where we see a need. We feel very strongly that the architects have a role in all of those components. And with our recent challenges across the globe, our leadership has been very much behind what is our principle of, the belief in diversity, the belief in the multiple cultures that are part of our community make design work the best. And we very much have supported and will continue to support that in our design process, and as well as our relations with our clients and communities.
Any ideas about how we can use some of the changes that we've made during this stay-at-home phase to improve our communities?
Well, we will always have folks who will choose to work from home. I mean, that's the other work environment. What that means is our neighborhoods now are like the old days. Remember the old, the blacksmith had his shop by his house. The women who were responsible for cottage industries of textiles worked from home. We now don't just have one place to live, one place to work. We're now looking at what could be a much broader interface of the city, which means, among other things, the challenge is we have less commuting, but we have more delivery of stuff. We're using energy in our own houses that maybe didn't have the same focus of energy optimization that the big buildings where we have, facility managers saying I can save some money while still making the building hum by being smart on my energy use. We're going to now have a broader need to look at resources and safety. One of the big interesting lessons learned is as people went home, they didn't have the right chairs to sit on. They would have a problem with their backs because they were sitting on the dining room chairs. And so something like ergonomics, how humans work, now need to be applied across not just the professional workspace, but all of our workspaces. And you'll also see in some of our writing with our dialogue, which is a series of a connection, a network connection to a series of these thought pieces around different kinds of workplaces, living places, community places, that, even rethinking our house, if we're going to be working from home for perhaps a few months because something pops up or we feel more comfortable and it still works, we're working from our, say, collective office, we're working in a park because being outside may in fact be a real good place for that middle ground and for health. How do we support that to be interchangeable in the right kind of human form, ergonomics? There's a lot I think we're learning about. We are good at working, playing in different places. How do we start focusing on the quality and the safety of those environments?
Well, I'm all for the outdoor office space if that's possible. As it relates to office space, over the years, we've kind of moved from that traditional office space with four walls and a door. We kind of moved into this open air office environment. Do you think that there's a chance that we might go back to that more conventional office space, or do you think the next normal will include this open air, if you will, office configuration?
Well, you're asking what is probably at the moment the $64,000 question. On one hand, we have offices that are going to need to accommodate people. And in the future, it probably may not be as dense as it may have gotten, in the last year or so, but, collaboration and the reality that many of those who are in work office environments, whether at home or in a centralized space, are also working with our clients in the clients' offices. You're not just sitting in the old days typing letters and sending it via mail, if you will. And so collaboration and coordination and socialization is always going to be part of the office environment. And that's an open environment. That's not invite someone into your office and close the door, because you're precipitating the very thing we think we need to have offices again for. The collaboration from a distance. We have a number of projects. For instance, we talked about our Houston Advanced Research Center, little project up in the Woodlands, little meaning scale. That was a group that wanted a research kind of focused huddle room. That is, they created their own super focused small offices that could be, separated from the larger hubbub of the office environment. At the moment, that's a great idea with the current challenge of public health. You've got, a small office you can huddle, but it's small enough you don't want to necessarily invite anyone in. And so do we have these big offices that use a lot of space and we have to have massive amounts of space and people don't see each other, which was kind of the life I had when I worked with HARC before they moved to their new campus? Or do we have little teeny cells like you see in science fiction movies? We don't yet know. We do know that we need to space out. We do know we need to make sure that if there's, if you will, bad behavior, that we kind of, in our built environment, make sure that a sneeze doesn't carry too far. But there's a lot of unanswered questions about mechanical systems, about materials, and whether, though the CDC and a lot of the researchers are getting better handles recently on, touching things, is it as problematic as we once thought? This idea of the touchless work environment, you go in and doors open automatically and things start without you touching things. There's some advantage to that, both for speed of moving through, like, if you will, airports. What we don't know is where that long-term capital investment in an economically challenged time really makes sense. Do we tear up offices and put up a whole series of very small cubicles that go to the ceiling? Well, then you don't have much airflow and you don't have that connection to the outside that actually makes you work better and makes you immune systems feel better, versus a windowless, floor to ceiling temporary divider that's not a place that anybody wants to come to work. It's got to be attractive to have people even want to use it to begin with.
Well, we clearly have more questions than we have answers.
Yes, that's
public transportation. Is public transportation still viable given this virus?
what's interesting is in looking across the globe, particularly those coming back, campuses, if we will be having universities open in the fall, and the transportation mode is vital just to get across campuses. But my point is the transportation industry has been sharing best, if you will, practices, lessons learned in an amazing way. Even as the virus was hitting one part of the world, the rest of the world's mobility folks were saying, how do we tackle how often we clean? What do we clean with? Arguably the mass transit or public transit has been built from its inception to be cleanable. You look at the often somewhat sterile materiality. I don't believe that the transit industry is going to be caught literally, unawares. I think they're going to be sharing a lot. I think there is the perceived issue of queuing and staging and waiting on platforms that, how do we get our arms around that? The actual equipage and its movement, maintaining separation from the drivers, from, those who are, clients, and how the clients space themselves and how we educate that spacing. That's a mobility expert that I'm not, the expert on, but from an observation, I think we're getting a lot of best practices shared globally quickly that, we're not reinventing the wheels and we're not trying some new things. We're kind of seeing what works. And I have great confidence that, we're going to be looking at a transition period where, not everybody's going to want to own a car, can afford to own a car. And how that public transportation, either short or long haul, will run. We've got, smart entrepreneurs running those systems. They're going to find ways to make the economics work, but it's going to take some time. So it's still very much a question, but I believe public transit will always be part of the mix. It's just how that works in a time of, increased awareness of wellness and the COVID challenges.
Well, in terms of best practices and the mix, any thoughts of best practices on design for mixed use developments in light of the virus?
Well, what's interesting, mixed use development has all kinds of advantages in the big picture in terms of the economics, the 24/7 use of that property, of creating an appropriate density so that people live, work, play without going great distances. Arguably driving and air pollution have a direct connection to health and wellness also. So finding that balance, I think there's going to be a rethinking of, how tight spaces are and what are public spaces. We do know in the short term, the rethinking of what is amenity, the idea of a buffet is probably out for a while, if not perhaps for a very long period of time, and looking how the grab and go food works. People still need to have lunch, and people will still have the idea of, I need to buy something. And we're seeing that come back to how do we encourage through communication, using, my favorite tool is, how do we make use of these things to help us, sort of, if you will, have a reservation to pick something up or grab and go. We're going to be looking at more of a, what we call design experience reality of, cues through our own computers, our own iPads, iPhones, perhaps screens to tell us, here's what to do to stay safe as you go into certain spaces and zones, whether it's the office or a mixed use element. So it behooves the owners of these spaces, once again, to provide a clarity and a level of, I'd say, expectation of what I'm going to see that makes that attractive, whether it be a retail space, a hotel space. And again, residential in close proximity to these other services means you don't have to worry about, public transportation. If anything, this, consequence may be, I want to live downtown to walk to work and walk to stores and walk to the events I feel very important, I want to connect to. So there's this, everybody's going to have a very different approach, and our entrepreneurial spirit will probably respond to it very quickly in a way that meets those expectations and safety and comfort levels.
Well, Rives, I have to tell you, it's great to have smart people like yourself, your team at Gensler, thinking about these things and coming up with these innovative solutions. But what can people like our viewers, the lay people, do in the community to help things be more viable and healthy?
Well, of course, the audience on a call like this are community leaders. So there's probably, I'm thinking off the cuff here, several levels of strategy. I think, to be honest, as a good Christian, we need to treat each other with respect and dignity, which means, all right, I may not believe in a mask, but maybe those around me are concerned. So maybe for the benefit of my community, I take the high ground. I do the physical distance. I keep the mask, which is making sure I don't create problems for others. It's, treat others as we would be respecting to be treated ourselves. The idea being here that, we are a community, a very diverse community that has challenges. So as community leaders on this call, I think we lead by example and respect. And though, houses of worship and other components that are about our community ethic and spirit need to be supported, let's find that right balance of engagement. On the individual level, I think there's something of perhaps recognizing a reality that we in our modern world have perhaps forgotten, which is cause and consequence. We do something and something happens. So, sneezing without covering, maybe we need to be, aware of that. Or I wash my hands more regularly, not because I don't want to get sick, but pushing the elevator button. We're going to still have to have those kind of interconnections, whether we use some fancy, kind of technology, extenders, Q-tips, whatever. I mean, the idea being, be aware of your surroundings, be aware of those who are around you and their feelings, but most importantly, recognize decisions we make about how we consume. Is there more plastic? It has, frankly, the use of plastic, the use of materials, we need to be respectful of what that, use means in terms of I use it and what's the life cycle thinking. And so decisions have a life cycle consequence. And I think that as leaders in Houston has always been our forte. Let's elevate that conversation about a decision has a long-term impact. Let's make some smart decisions that way.
Rives, thank you so much for being so generous with your time today. We appreciate all the insights and ideas that you've shared with us today. So thank you so much. I want to also thank our viewing audience for joining us today and remind you to mark your calendars for Thursday, June the 11th at 5:45 p.m. We will host our final leadership webcast with Dr. Stephen Kleinberg. Dr. Kleinberg will talk about his new book, Prophetic City, Houston on the Cusp of a Change in America, and he will be interviewed by the Houston Chronicle's editor of opinion, Lisa Falkenberger. Until then, I'm Russell Richard. Good day, stay safe, and be well.